Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of the New Stack, and you are listening to the New Stack Analysts podcast. Each week, we look at application development and management at scale. 3Scale is the sponsor for this episode of the New Stack Analysts. 3Scale is a leader in the API management space. At AWS reInvent, 3Scale integrated with AWS new API gateway service that uses AWS Lambda. You can learn more on the 3Scale blog and our post for this episode on the New Stack. That's the numeral 3 for 3scale.net. Now let's get to the show. Alex Williams here of the New Stack for the New Stack Analyst Show here from AWS reInvent. And I have some guests with us today. Why don't we just go around the horn? Al, tell us who you are, and Steve, and then Rachel give a little intro.
Okay, Alex, this is Al Hilwa. I cover application development, software development at IDC. I look at developers and that kind of stuff. So, next.
Great. My name is Steve Willmott. I'm the CEO of 3Scale. We're an API infrastructure company. About 650 customers, all of which are delivering APIs in various ways, and we provide security, access control, and those kind of things. And we're really focused on kind of APIs as a mass market phenomenon. We see companies from all sorts of different sectors doing it and supporting them, in that endeavor, and kind of an exciting world of APIs emerging.
So tell us what you. Okay, we'll go back to you. So Rachel, why don't you tell us?
Yes, indeed.
Sure, I'm Rachel Chalmers. I'm a principal with Ignition Partners. We're a boutique venture capital firm. We invest only in enterprise software companies, B2B. Before I joined Ignition, I was 13 years an analyst with 451 Research, where I ran the infrastructure practice. Okay, great. So now, Steve, tell us what's going on this week. Tell us a little bit about the news you have going on, and what's happening with 3Scale.
Yeah, well, there's obviously a lot of news out of Amazon that we saw this morning, a lot of things that they're doing. One of the things that they announced recently is they announced an API gateway, which is it's a gateway to allow you to throttle traffic and control it. And that's one of those things that a lot of companies want. And we provide it in various guises. We actually use Nginx to do that. We do it across Akamai. And it became natural for us to integrate the Amazon gateway as well. So we couple together, and you can use all the management layers we have with their enforcement layers. And it's impressive how Amazon's pushing the boundary forward. And from our point of view, we want to plug into that ecosystem, but also help people go across the clouds and on-premise to cloud and a whole bunch of things like that. So that's what we've been doing.
Okay, great. So that speaks to kind of this whole new API world we're living in, right? But we were just kind of like, Rachel came in, it's like, oh, computers. What's this frustration that you have?
I was joking. I love computers.
I know we all do, but there's something to that, though, too, as well. It's like, there's more to computers. There's like, isn't everything a computer now? Isn't everything a node? And what does that mean for in this API world?
I mean, that's just my reaction to AWS reInvent, which is growing like Moore's Law. I mean, it feels like it doubles every day. There's just twice as many people here as there were yesterday, and everybody, doing the deep technology dive on their particular slice. But at the same time, I think back to 10 years ago, when conferences like this were being run by vendors like IBM and Oracle and Microsoft, and how soul-crushing that was to be in this environment where you were trying to be squished in line with the corporate roadmap ahead. And, developers' needs were more or less entirely disregarded. It was all about IT, and it was all about the vendors trying to maximize what IT was spending on infrastructure. Once you'd spent it on the infrastructure, you were locked in, and there was no chance of recouping that capital for at least another 10 years. That was a really brutal environment. So when I make fun of AWS, it's in the spirit that, I absolutely love being here because everyone is so enthusiastic and everyone's so excited, and it's a developer-led conference. The technology that AWS announces is right up there on the site. You can play with it as soon as they unveil it in the keynote. It really is an enormous transformation.
So Steve, and then I'll get to you, Al. It's like, Steve, I'm curious from your perspective. I've known you a long time in this space, and and I think of those days back in 2006, 2007, when we saw the kind of like the real emergence of the RESTful API, right? I'm curious from your perspective, how did that, how has that played out in your book? I mean, you talk about the soul-crushing aspect of those events, right? In those times, that seemed to be a very defining time to kind of like almost like a breakthrough, from that kind of a world.
Yeah.
But, what does that mean for today and going forward? I mean, there's a lot that's happened. It's been a long continuum.
I think a lot of things happen at the same time. Well, now they're at the same time because they're in the past, right? But it was probably a 2-year period, right, where you had Amazon first opened up. Actually, that created just that compute resource that was there. You had more and more of these REST APIs, which weren't that common before, come out, and they're just a very simple way of doing things across the web. More people could do them. They were experimental at the time, so Flickr and those kind of folks had APIs, and that's what we got started as well. And it made kind of the back-end side more agile, way more agile. You could connect software systems together. But then you also got, the iPhone had come out, all the apps were on the phone, but suddenly, one generation after that, it was the apps marketplace, all of which needed data. And it just created kind of this nexus of kind of more lightweight interfaces with lighter weight backends, and more of this, let's connect all this stuff together. And that's played out now. I think there was definitely a period of 3-4 years where it was mostly Silicon Valley tech companies that were, hey, Twitter, Facebook, API, and all those things. Now it's, we have customers like Campbell Soup and Adidas and all those kind of folks, and they're taking advantage of it. And it's creating a lot more of those resources that are programmable that you can just use to create apps on TVs, phones, drones, whatever. And that's an exciting thing. But it was like a 2-year period almost where almost all the rules changed. It just wasn't obvious to everyone, right?
I think RESTful APIs in particular came out of the complete disaster that was the WS Star specifications
right.
and SOAP. Completely overspec'd, a bunch of corporations trying really hard to control and constrain what developers could do. And what we're talking about is a backlash that was in many ways enabled by the fact that a lot of the money had gone out of the industry in the early 2000s. Developers were able to claim a lot more power. And we're talking about a big cultural shift from a centralized command and control industry to something that's a lot more collaborative and a lot more distributed, where developers have considerably more say in how things can be architected.
So now, Al, you were at this event, the dinner last night that I was at, and we were talking a lot about orchestration of container technologies and microservices and such. What is your viewpoint on what's being discussed here? Thinking about those patterns that we're seeing now, because now it's becoming distributed almost to an nth degree that we never would have imagined.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, I see this sort of in a very long-term pattern. The first 50 years of computing, companies were just trying to do the same thing they were doing faster and cheaper. But things started pivoting right around the internet in the late 90s. And then companies started actually engaging with their customers differently. And of course, the iPhone changed everything and sort of doubled down and multiplied that hugely. And I actually see a lot of the API revolution as hugely related to mobile. Mobile apps require, if you're going to build mobile apps in a strategic fashion, you have to, you're not going to build one because they're typically single function and very small compared to old sort of console desktop apps. So you build a whole family of them, and you have to therefore build the backing services to support them. All the magic happens in the back end, all the data is stored in the back end. I mean, you might think of a recipe app, but where are the recipes stored, and where are your recipes stored? They're stored in the back end, so you can share them across devices or share them with other people. So the APIs had to emerge to support this, and I think a lot of cloud really became huge after mobile because so much was happening outside of the firewall already, thanks to customer engagement, consumer revolution, and that kind of brought, if you like, the camel's nose on, outside the tent or inside the tent, right. Whatever the metaphor, So at that point, people started doing more in the cloud, period, including their own internal systems, and we can't go back anymore, I think.
Right.
The trend long term is to keep doing more things in the cloud. APIs are the way you structure, and APIs are sort of the other side of this sort of microservices, thing that we talked about yesterday. And
right.
Microservices is a new way you design applications, much smaller in function. But okay, so if you're going to take a big monolithic system, break it up, and design everything as small applications, how are they going to talk to each other? Well, through these published APIs. So it sort of externalizes the way interoperability used to happen. It used to be things part of the long code base, function calls between things. You didn't have to really promote them to anyone. Small teams have to know about them. Nowadays, all the teams are working on their own services, and the interoperability between the different teams or the microservices is all with API. So API is a key ingredient of what's happening in the cloud.
Yeah. And I think actually, so mobile was sort of the first wave, and then HTML5 and single page apps even accelerated that, right? So now if you're using a cloud service and you actually change page in the middle, it's like, whoa, what happened there? Like it's all a page with a bunch of buttons that are all calling APIs in the background. So that web development has become more app-like as well. And then we see a lot of the old B2B things that you would used to do over SOAP. I mean, I have scars from implementing UDDI.
I'm sorry.
It's like, I know. I have therapy, regular basis.
There's lotion for that.
Yeah, exactly. there's drugs that help. But, that a lot of the B2B use cases are now just, hey, why do I build a bunch of one-to-one connections and why don't I just do one-to-N, right? And have a partner API, have an ecosystem of people that can use me. And even Amazon itself is a great example, right? You couldn't build half of the companies that are here without Amazon having a stable set of APIs that even other companies are adopting, right? So.
And what really fascinates me is what happens when you extend these trends out into the future. Because I think to some extent we still are re-implementing stuff that exists in the bits world, the brick and mortar world in the cloud, and that's the wrong metaphor to use. Even calling stuff like VPC, the virtual private cloud, that's not quite what it is. It's a disposable instance that you can offer to a customer, and we've got to start thinking of it as something you can throw away. It's a language change. We need new metaphors. Our metaphors are running out of juice. What I think is really a bellwether of the future is when you look at how WhatsApp is architected. They're supporting 900 million users with 50 engineers. They've got this massive messaging backplane.
Who's that?
WhatsApp. They've got this messaging backplane that they've built in Erlang, which is ludicrously performant. It's like a telecommunications switch more than an app. And I think that's where you're going to see the microservices coming together. They're going to have this monstrous communications channel behind, and then they're going to be exposed as lots of tiny little APIs to hundreds of millions of users, and it's a total change in the way we think about architecting.
I've been thinking
these
about
services.
that continuum, right? Like, and I've been asking a lot of people about this, right? What is what are your theories about the continuum? Because like, there's one theory, and that I've thrown out there. It's like, we've seen this. We're kind of seeing this kind of like this maturity of the virtualized infrastructure, which has its own continuum in itself. We're seeing kind of the emergence of container technologies, which has its own continuum in itself. And we also have now kind of this emergence of AWS Lambda, Parse, right? Firebase, right? These serverless architectures, which have their own continuum. And then, you go back to the kind of like the hypervisor again with discussions about unicorns. So I'm curious on what your guys' theories are about these continuums.
Continuums. That's a beautiful word, but
I love the word.
Yeah,
I've been using it a lot.
Obviously, yes. But I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned lambdas and sort of this whole shift. Look, again, computer science is always shifting towards this sort of abstraction. Take away the infrastructure, take away all the business of messing around with hardware and so on. Developers don't really want to deal with all that. And Lambda is a great example of this. It's a serverless. I think this is what's sort of being called right now. So don't even think about a server. It's really, we think of it as at IDC as a form of PaaS, or in that it's you don't have to think about the infrastructure. You don't have to think about the machine. It's just a very transient computing model, a minute to 5 minutes or whatever, and I think that's really the way things are going to end up. By the way, containers are a key piece of that, because if you can't spin a whole image or a container in a few seconds, then this is a no-go, right? VMs need about a minute and a half, depending on what kind of machine you have, or size of memory or whatever, to spin up. And containers really enable things like Lambda, enable this sort of abstraction. So continuum, I don't know. Where does that all lead us? Convergence, that's another good word for you. Mm-hmm. Think about convergence, continuum into convergence. And of course then there's the singularity, right? So,
right. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to think about. I think that we, the change that we've seen in our customers in the last 2 to 3 years is almost everybody has a clear business reason for launching their APIs, and they have the audience in mind. Whereas if you go back a few years before, that was like, well, let's throw it out there and see who uses it. And the audiences are different. Sometimes it's internal developers, sometimes it's close partners, and so forth. And one way to think about the continuum is to take it all the way to the UI. And I think our stand in the hall is right next to the Amazon Echo system, which you put in your kitchen and you just ask it for things, and it Googles for you, it turns your music on, but it also orders product. And I'm pretty sure at some point you'll be able to say, hey, I have cockroaches, get me someone who can fix that, and it'll say, hey, option 1 is they'll show up tomorrow and it'll cost you $50, or it'll be next week sometime, it'll be $35, right? And then so the interface has been taken over completely even from Google, right? We were used to Google being the kingpin of being the mediator of what services you use, but you got to have an API to be in that game, and it's even the interface side which is becoming seamless for the user. So it's a pretty interesting change.
So exactly that is now available in limited beta from Facebook. It's their M messaging platform, which I have to brag about because it's built on technology that Ignition invested in, Wit.ai, which was one of the great API players around voice recognition. That said, I think we need to be mindful of what we do. I think an API is a contract. An API is a relationship between...
Mindfulness is something I think is really needed.
And when we talk about serverless computing, there's real servers there. They're just somebody else's computers. These abstractions are a way of playing Jedi mind tricks on us. These are not the droids you're looking for.
we were talking about that. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think there's a big risk when we take these abstractions at face value in giving away all the power we've so painfully clawed back in the last 10 years. And, we've clearly created these new monoliths. Google and Facebook and Amazon are now much more powerful in the market than Oracle and IBM and Microsoft were back in the day. And I think we need to be very conscious of that and very aware of equity in those APIs, in those contracts.
So then I have a question for you. What is the literary metaphor for this trap that you speak of? Because you are speaking of a trap. You're saying that we are entrapping ourselves by believing that these are actually serverless. What's the metaphor for that?
There's the changeling myth from British folklore. Tam Lin is the sort of archetypal story where the fairy queen draws you into a dance and you dance with the fairy queen all night and you go back home the next morning and it's 100 years later and everybody you love is dead. So, we got drawn into these virtual environments, into this world of Amazon where everything's going to be, available to you immediately, and we're going to look around and find out that we have no business because Amazon owns all of the valuable part of our value chain.
That is the quote of the year on the TNS Analyst. Congratulations. That is the best thing I've ever heard on this. That was awesome. Now let's take a quick break before we get back to the second half of the show. Hey everyone, 3Scale is the sponsor for this episode of the New Stack Analysts. 3Scale is a leader in the API management space. At AWS reInvent, 3Scale integrated with AWS new API gateway service that uses AWS Lambda. You can learn more on the 3Scale blog and our post for this episode on the new Stack. That's the numeral 3 for 3scale.net. Now let's get back to the show. We're talking about Galactica. And James Governor was talking about, I've never seen Galactica. You guys probably have. You've seen it?
No, it's got one of the best women presidents in fiction.
And it's and there's like these, there's characters who they're basically immutable, right? They're, and they just reappear, when the mothership decides that there should be new ones, essentially like containers, right? They kind of serve as like microservices in their own ways, right? So we had long discussions on that and Star Wars too, and the Federation and the Force. So
I have to put in a plug for my absolute favorite writer at the moment, Anne Leckie. The third novel in her Ancillary Justice trilogy just came out yesterday. It's about it's a space opera. It's based in a universe like Galactica's or Star Wars, but you gradually realize over the course of the first book that you're looking at it from the point of view of the bad guys.
Yes.
And it's an exploration of what it means to be the evil colonist oppressor. It's fantastic.
Wow. Well, so moving on.
How do you top that?
No, actually, one of the things I was actually been thinking about a lot, probably this is a good group to talk about it with, is it seems like there's no goals whatsoever. It's like there's always just like this rush into developing these. I think this is what you're talking about. It's like okay, serverless architectures, now we're going to talk about serverless architectures and they are the new salvation, blah, 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 right? But we're talking about AI in the same kind of a way, right? We're talking about all these kind of new emergent technologies, but we never think about their outcomes. We don't think about what this means for us all. And it's something I've wondered is like, are we getting to the point where we actually need to start setting goals for ourselves, like saying, okay, here's a group of people who do care about, what all these technologies mean? Are there 1-year goals? Are there 5-year goals? Should we be having 100-year goals? Should we be having 300-year goals so we don't fall into these traps? Because if you do fall, if you're completely reactionary, then it seems like an inevitable outcome.
Yeah, it seems really interesting you mentioned this because it seems like we're getting at a stage in our computing world where we have people like Elon Musk or Bill Gates are saying, be careful where we're going and the rise of the machines, right? And where AI, the continuum of AI is going to get us. It's funny because right around the 40s, we had people had a lot of anxiety. The people who were putting the atom bomb together had a lot of anxiety about where it's going and whether they should be working on it. They had second thoughts about that. And I wonder if we're going to get into that mode where a lot of our computer scientists are going to start going, stop, no more. We're not going to work anymore on this kind of thing. I don't know. Yeah.
I think there's a couple of interesting dimensions here. I think one is, what Rachel was talking about abstraction. If you keep going up the stack, you can either forget how to do that stuff, and sometimes it might be important, or it's just no longer available. And I think there's all this new technology. Sometimes it's right to use it, sometimes it's not. And as long as the options stay available, I think it's powerful because you can do more new stuff faster. But you just may need that other option, and if they go away, that gets very tricky. So I think we're producing technology that can create a lot of value, and bringing it back to APIs for me, so we have customers like the city of New York. They could never build all the apps that they want, but they can put the data out there, and then people can use it. So it's a choice, and it adds value. And on the AI side, I don't know about AI. I actually have an AI research background previous to the company, right? I don't know about it ever getting too powerful for us, and I guess it could. The other
why are you skeptical?
No, I think it probably can, and it has the capacity. But there's a long period where it's going to need to be a human-machine symbiosis in a lot of ways. And I think the biggest problem we have now is not the danger of it, it's the fact that it could result in more and more concentration of wealth, because there are certain companies that have the capacity to do this and others that don't.
Even more concentration of wealth?
Even more.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, will robots take care of jobs type of stuff. And I think we actually have a choice in that. We could make the technology more complicated and make it just a small elite that can program these things and create products that everyone else just uses. Or we can create the right technologies that the majority of the populace can do things. So things like IFTTT and Zapier and all of those, to me they enable people who are not programmers to create value in pretty creative ways that you can't teach. You can't teach a coder necessarily to be a doctor and to do the right things, but you could give better and richer tools to doctors, right? So I think there's a societal impact to what we do, and there are choices, and we may not be making the right ones, but there's a lot of power to do so I hope we do.
I'm going to argue with the premises of your question. I don't know what parties you're going to, Alex, but I'm an unreconstructed 90s tech idealist, and what I see is an industry that's so invested in the future that it makes us kind of ridiculous. I mean, all of the people who are doing Holacracy, Tony Hsieh, people write articles making fun of him, but what he's trying to do is take that cultural shift to distribute power more broadly and implement it in his corporate structure. You mentioned Bill Gates and Elon Musk, and they're doing brilliant work in trying to secure our energy future and trying to
but they're warning.
Eliminate disease.
I think Al was saying
they're warning about the dangers of technology, but so am I. But I would say that Bill Gates has made a stunning transformation from one of the most aggressive corporate raiders in the industry to somebody that I think every philanthropist can look up to now, using exactly the same skill set. And I think that's the DNA of our industry is, we're super competitive because we're the nerds that got picked up in high school and we got by because of our coding skills. But yeah, we want to build a better world as well, where people aren't bullied and where there isn't this enormous wealth disparity, and we're not chucking plastic into the ocean. I see tons of people working on issues like diversity, genomic, personal health efforts. You go down to Facebook and it's the Zoolander campus. Everybody's really, really incredibly good looking, and they're building schools for kids to learn how to do stuff good. It's absurd, but it's
Zoolander.
Incredibly sincere.
That's a funny movie.
It's absurd because it's sincere, and that's the nature of our industry.
It's absurd because it is sincere. So because people are so sincere about it, it makes it appear like it doesn't have that sense.
And that's the whole allure of the Fairy Queen. We think we're doing socially valuable work. We think that the work we're doing is significant and important, and that's the dance that we get caught up in, which distracts us from the fact that Palantir is the most sinister surveillance weapon we've ever built.
Right.
We built it almost innocuously, almost without realizing what we were doing, and now we've built a police state. Almost by accident. It's our idealism that blinds us, that seduces us into building these weapons.
So we're running a story on Saturday by Alexis Richardson of Weaveworks, and he's writing about... No, it's actually not by Alexis, excuse me, what am I thinking? It's by Jamie Dobson of Container Solutions out of Amsterdam. And Jamie is arguing that what we're actually seeing is we are seeing that software is eating the world, but it's eating capitalism too. And I'm not so sure about that. I mean, there's still this incredible concentration of wealth. His point is that, in a few generations, people will think it's kind of absurd how much we worked. But I'm not sure if that equates to
People have been saying that for 100 years.
So true.
I think that's a human thing, right? Everyone imagines that all the progress is in the past because it's like, wow, look at what happened in the last 2 years. Surely it's now we're at stasis. Or you see some innovation, but you sort of think, well, now I kind of know what there is to know. But 5 years down the line, you're again going, wow, what happened there? Right? So there's this kind of like, well, this tendency of the human race to get into, everyone's comfortable. Fact is, we're on a planet with limited resources. We haven't enabled anyone to live for more than like a week on any other, astronomical body, and there's all sorts of problems that the human race would have to solve. And I don't think that, maybe it's crises that move you or whatever it is, but I think you have to find ways to enable people to be productive and reach these bigger goals. And when someone says, we'll all be living a life of leisure, I don't think that's generally the way humans are wired. Some people are, but
Yeah,
what made the Manhattan Project possible was the existential threat of the Nazis.
Yeah, that's true. Do we not have that anymore? That's an interesting question.
We certainly do, but
it's an alien invasion.
It's a beast of a different color.
We've got a human invasion. That's perfectly scary enough.
Yeah.
We still talk about existential threats quite a bit in terms of actually
global warming or some of the other things that are going on right now.
Also in terms of the most sophisticated of criminal espionage and the most sophisticated forms of hacking, right? That there's an existential threat associated with that.
But we're kind of constantly attributing to malice what's better explained by stupidity. I mean, the Volkswagen diesel scandal is going to take down Volkswagen much faster than any APT is going to take down any other company. And that was just, overweening hubris and incompetence. I'm bitter because I have a very nice diesel Golf.
Okay, yeah. So you're saying it's not malice? Well, okay, I don't want to argue with you on that, but I want to get back to a point that was made earlier about abstraction. I think you made it, Rachel, which is, I think it's interesting you mentioned that, we're losing touch with how to do some of this stuff, and people said that a lot about cars, that you shouldn't really ever drive unless you know how to change the oil, because you never know when you might have to stop somewhere and change your car's oil or tighten the bolts or whatever, or change the belt. And of course we've gone way beyond that, and that's just the nature of technology, that abstraction is actually a necessary process to make it possible for our fairly limited brains, as much as they're being aided by sort of the software exoskeletons that that we're using every day, like Googling things or whatever. But our brains are very limited, and it's the only way to remove some of the details out so that we can do more with a particular layer of technology, is to actually rise up in the abstraction. So I see the abstraction not only as positive but necessary.
But I think it is.
Yeah.
It is critically necessary. The only thing is that if you think of computing from like the early 80s through to maybe 2010, what happened is that every piece of technology, you got the operating system, then you got some key apps in the operating system. They all got compacted down by Linux mostly into the operating system, became free, and then the new layers of value got added on top, and people innovated on top.
And that's a commoditization process.
And I hope that continues.
Yeah.
There is a danger though that if you go too far too fast, then there's a tax layer that gets put in the bottom, and no one can get around it anymore, right? So Amazon's doing a great job. People talk about the innovation, but they also drop the prices very regularly, and that's great that they're able to do that.
And it's good what Amazon's doing with prices, and a lot of people think of it as maybe they're doing it out of the kindness of their heart, but they're really doing it because there's a whole under ecosystem of competitive technologies. To every Amazon there's a DigitalOcean or some other hosters that are underpricing them, and so often they have to keep that price in balance.
Well, I guess my point is more, if Windows was the operating system and Linux hadn't come along, then that might have been a forever monopoly, right? That no one could get around. But the fact that there were other ways of doing the operating system part that could just get compacted to near zero pushed everything down. And so I'm sure that will also happen with cloud computing and all these things, but that's kind of the dynamic that we have to maintain. Otherwise, we end up in a
I think competition is the key to keeping prices in check, right?
Yeah, I guess it sounds obvious when you put it that way.
That is...
Yeah, it's fascinating that the competition came from Linux, which was basically a bunch of people collaborating in their spare time, at least for the first 5-8 years.
I think that is an incredible story, that how Linux competed with... now, Linux based on Unix, and the model was very popular.
It was a collaborative model.
With developers. When I was going to school... Unix was the way we learned how to do all these tricks, as developers, and so it's interesting how that battle sort of shifted towards Windows for a while, and then Linux came back thanks to open source. People say that Unix was mishandled in the early days with AT&T and so on, and not really opened and licensed, and then BSD Unix came and kind of began that open source movement. And anyway, that story is history, but I think open source is an interesting angle. I think you mentioned somebody who said software is eating the world.
Yeah.
But what is it going to do? I think there was a
software
sort of
is eating the world, but capitalism too.
And capitalism, yes, and it's going to eat capitalism. And I think if I unpack that, it's sort of saying that we're all going to be open source socialists at some point. And I'm not sure that's where we're going. I think if you look at the open source world, it is definitely huge, and it is eating the world. But it's often used as the basis for more capital. Right? A lot of the startups that you probably invest in have an open source core or some kind of open source story, and people, in fact, will put something out in open source if it's an innovation, mostly to create a moat around the technology, because the moment it's built and put in open source and we have a community around it, who's going to go invent another one? To some degree, why would anyone go build another container to be more popular than Docker anymore when Docker is out there and it's open source, right? So in a way, it is just as much of a tool of capitalism as, and I think a lot of the open, Richard Stallman is rolling in his office chair at MIT, but he's not gonna, wouldn't like hearing that, but that's actually what's happened with open source.
So I have a last question for you. So we talked about the metaphor of the fairy and falling into the trap. Who are the protagonists that see the trap and don't fall into it?
It's a good question. I was thinking as you were talking that the people I really feel for in our current economy are the millennials, who graduate from school with a CS degree and $200,000 in debt, and really the only career available to them that's going to pay back those loans is a tech career.
Poor
and so
guys.
you talk about the
girls.
short-termism and the sense of urgency that these kids have. It's that or eating ramen and working at Starbucks. And I feel I'm a venture capitalist. I believe in this economy. But I also believe that a social safety net would improve our ability to look at the long term, to make long-term decisions, to invest in R&D. I think the fact that so many people in our industry are facing either outcompete everyone in a tech job or go and teach in Teach for America, it's a really terrible choice to put in front of 20-somethings who are brilliant and whose brain we can very ill afford to waste in short-term activities.
Steve, any last thoughts?
I agree with that, and I think building on it there is a responsibility to produce technology which can be used by a lot of different groups of people, and you don't have to be a programmer to use. And I think everyone lauds the web for being such a powerful information diffuser and a tool, and it's been amazing. I mean, there's just so many more people that have learned from that and been able to contribute things. But even now we've gone to a place where even you used to be able to hack together a web page in text editor. You can't do that anymore. So that means the people that write the web who can create websites technically has shrunk. And you now have blogging platforms and things like that, but they're very much siloed and controlled. So, when I look at things like APIs and the apps that use APIs, and how do we make that easy to create on both sides? Because that means someone doesn't have to go into tech career. They can do amazing creative things, in whatever the career of choice is, but they have the resources available. And I do think it's a technical choice that we are making, and the more people that sort of urge to make it available to as many people as possible to be the creators, that's kind of the thing that is important.
There, and I think in other regards, there's a lot of people in the millennial generation who are recognizing that, right? And they're saying, well, I need to apply my thinking and my brains towards ways that will make me feel like, that I'm actually doing something. Yeah. And I think that's a big factor as well. But hey, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. This has been a great episode of the New Stack Analysts. I'm hard-pressed to find a better one than we've had this year, so thanks for your time, and enjoy our AWS reInvent.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's show. Thank you very much for joining us. 3Scale is the sponsor for this episode of the New Stack Analysts. 3Scale is a leader in the API management space. At AWS reInvent, 3Scale integrated with AWS new API gateway service that uses AWS Lambda. You can learn more on the 3Scale blog and our post for this episode on the New Stack. That's the numeral 3 for 3scale.net. Audio editing and sound design for the New Stack Analyst podcast is provided by Broken Hours. You can find them at brokenhours.com. Thanks again, and hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.